Victor Hale didn't knock. That was the first thing people in Garrison noticed about him. The man never knocked. He pushed open doors like he owned whatever was on the other side, and most of the time, in one way or another, he did. So when he rode his black horse through the main street of town on that bitter January morning in 1881 and stopped in front of the Mercantile, nobody was surprised that he didn't dismount politely. He just sat there in the saddle, looking down at the small group of people clustered near the hitching post. A woman with 3 children, their bags piled in the snow around their feet, their faces red from cold. "Harper woman," he said loud enough for half the street to hear, "I heard you were looking for work." Adeline Harper looked up. She didn't flinch. That too people would remember later. "I am," she said. Victor smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Whitmore's ranch posted a notice. Cook wanted. He paused, letting his horse shift beneath him. "But I'll save you the trip. Man like Ethan Whitmore doesn't take in charity cases. You show up there with 3 kids and no husband, he'll shut the gate in your face before you finish your sentence." The youngest boy, couldn't have been more than 6, pressed closer to his mother's side. The girl, maybe 13, lifted her chin and stared at Victor with eyes that had already seen too much disappointment to be scared of a man on a horse. Victor leaned forward in the saddle. "Now, I have a position. Cook for my house. Half what Whitmore's paying, but at least you won't waste a 2-hour ride in the cold to hear the word no." Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the largest bag, handed a smaller one to her oldest son, and said, "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Hale." She turned toward the road north. Victor watched her go. Then he laughed, short, dismissive, the laugh of a man who had already decided how the story ended. "Suit yourself," he called after her, "but don't say I didn't offer." Nobody on that street said anything. They just watched Adeline Harper and her 3 children walk out of town in the direction of Silver Creek Ranch, into a wind that was picking up hard from the mountains, carrying the kind of cold that had no patience for stubbornness. And if you had been standing there watching them disappear down that road, you would have asked yourself the same thing every person on that street was quietly asking. What kind of person keeps walking when every sensible door is already closed? If you've ever had to keep walking when you had nothing left but the road ahead, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end, because what happens at that gate is something you won't want to miss. If this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel and hit the like button so more stories like this can find the people who need them. And drop a comment with your city and country. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that road, because Adeline Harper was about to knock on the one door that everyone in Garrison was certain would never open. Beisamt. The notice had been tacked to the Mercantile board for 11 days before Adeline saw it. She had arrived in Garrison on a Wednesday, her money down to $4.30, her children quieter than children ought to be. They had come from Billings on a freight wagon, wedged between crates of dry goods and a crate of live chickens that her youngest son Oliver had spent the entire journey trying to make friends with through the slats. The driver had dropped them at the edge of town without ceremony, pointed at the main street, and driven off. The notice said, "Cook wanted. Silver Creek Ranch. Meals for 8 ranch hands in 1 household. Inquire at ranch gate. Fair wages." No nonsense. No nonsense. Adeline had read those 2 words twice. She respected that. She was a woman made of very little nonsense herself. What the notice did not say, what nothing in Garrison said plainly, though it was understood by everyone, was that Silver Creek Ranch belonged to Ethan Whitmore, who had not hired a household worker in 3 years, who had been managing meals for his ranch hands through a rotating arrangement of terrible cooking and creative suffering, and who had the reputation of a man who had decided, somewhere around the time his wife died, that people were more trouble than they were worth. Adeline didn't know any of that yet. She knew only what the notice said. She had spent the night at the church. The minister's wife had taken pity on the children. And in the morning she had gathered her family, settled her bags onto her shoulders, and started up the road north. Victor Hale's little scene in front of the Mercantile had cost her perhaps 5 minutes. She had listened to him, considered his offer for exactly the time it took her to understand it was not actually an offer, but a trap, and she had kept walking. Nathan, her oldest at 15, walked beside her and said nothing for the first mile. He was a boy who had learned that silence was sometimes the best way to show support, and also the best way to keep from saying something that would worry his mother. His jaw was set. His boots were thin. "How far?" he finally asked. "About 2 hours," Adeline said. "And if he says no?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Then we come back and figure out what's next." Victor Hale said, "I heard what Victor Hale said." Nathan was quiet again. Behind them, Lillian, 13 years old, sharp-eyed, already keeping a running count of their remaining money in her head without being asked, had the second bag over her shoulder and was walking with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste energy. Oliver walked beside her, his hand in hers, looking at the frost on the fence posts with the kind of attention that only very young children and very old philosophers give to small things. "Mama," Oliver said, "does the man at the ranch have any dogs?" "I don't know." "I hope he has dogs." Adeline almost smiled. Almost. The road to Silver Creek Ranch was not a hospitable road. It climbed slightly from the valley floor, cut between stands of bare cottonwood, and ran alongside a creek that was iced over in patches and moving slow and dark in the gaps. The wind came down from the mountains in irregular gusts that pushed against them like something with intent. Adeline had grown up in Virginia, where winters were cold, but not like this. Montana winter was not a season. It was an argument, and the argument was that you did not belong here and you should reconsider. She had been having this argument with the state of Montana for 6 months. She was not ready to lose it yet. Her husband Thomas had brought them here in the spring of 1880, full of something between optimism and stubbornness that she had always loved and sometimes hated about him. He had a letter from a cousin about land available near Billings, about opportunities, about a new life that needed building. Thomas Harper was not a man who could leave a thing unbuilt. So they had come. He had died in October, a fever that came fast and left no room for negotiation. 3 weeks from healthy to gone, and Adeline had sat beside him in a rented room in Billings with her children around her and felt the specific terror of a woman who had always been half of a plan suddenly being the whole of one. She had buried him, settled the small debts, sold what she could, kept what they needed, and started looking for work. She had cooked all her life. She was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that came from necessity and attention rather than ambition. She had kept a household running for Thomas through lean years and leaner ones. She could do this. She just needed someone to give her the chance. The gate to Silver Creek Ranch appeared around a bend in the road, and Adeline stopped walking. It was a substantial gate, iron and timber, hung between 2 posts that had been sunk deep and true. The kind of construction that communicated something about the man who built it. It was not decorative. It was a gate that meant what it said. "This is the edge of my property, and you are on the other side of it." There was no bell. No sign asking visitors to announce themselves. Just the gate, and beyond it a long drive that curved up toward a set of ranch buildings that were large and solid and, from this distance, utterly quiet. Nathan was already looking at her. "Well," Adeline said, and went to the gate and pushed it open. It wasn't locked. She had not expected it to be. A man who locked his gate during daylight hours was either afraid or arrogant, and somehow she had already formed an impression of Ethan Whitmore that didn't fit either description exactly. She wasn't sure yet what it did fit. They walked up the drive. The buildings came into focus. A main house, large and practical, built for function rather than impression. A barn, several outbuildings, fencing that went on in organized lines across the property, marking pastures that were empty now in winter. Everything was maintained. Nothing was decorative. A man came out of the barn. He was big, not in the showy way that some men use their size, but in the settled, unglamorous way of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and whose body had simply become the shape of that work. He was probably 50, maybe a few years past it. His coat was heavy and dark and had seen better decades. He stopped when he saw them and did not move. He looked at Adeline, then at Nathan, then at Lillian, then at Oliver, who was looking back at him with the frank, assessing stare of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't looking. Then he looked back at Adeline. "I put 1 notice up," he said. "1. "Yes," Adeline said, "for a cook." "I know." He looked at the children again. Something moved in his face. Not quite irritation, but the expression of a man whose plan had just become more complicated than he had intended. The notice didn't say anything about a family. No, Adeline agreed. It didn't. There was a silence that had some weight to it. The wind pushed at them. Oliver shifted from one foot to the other. "Are you the man who lives alone?" Oliver asked. The question came out of nowhere, the way children's questions do, and it landed in the middle of the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan Whitmore looked at the boy. His expression did something complicated that Adeline couldn't quite read. "Yes," he said after a moment. His voice was flat, but not unkind. "I am." Oliver considered this. "That sounds lonely," he said, with the simple authority of someone who had not yet learned that you aren't supposed to say things like that to strangers. Ethan looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at Adeline. "How old is he?" "6, Adeline said. "The others?" "Nathan is 15. Lillian is 13. He was quiet. She could see him doing the calculation. Not the math of whether she could cook, but the larger arithmetic of what it meant to have a woman and 3 children on a working ranch through a Montana winter, what it cost in space and heat and disruption, what it meant for a man who had spent years carefully arranging his life around the absence of exactly these complications. She didn't help him with the calculation. She had made her case by showing up. She would let him arrive at his own answer. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Billings. Before that, Virginia." "Husband?" "Dead. October." Something passed across his face. Not pity exactly, more like recognition. "How long have you been in Garrison?" "Since Wednesday." "And you walked up here?" "Yes." He looked at Nathan's boots, at the bags, at Adeline's hands, which were red from the cold and were gripping the strap of her bag without shaking, which cost her something, though she didn't show it. "You cooked before?" he said. "All my life." "For how many people?" "However many were there." He almost said something. She could see it, the refusal forming, the practical objection, the reasonable explanation for why this wouldn't work. She had rehearsed arguments against several possible versions of it on the 2-hour walk up here. She was ready. What she was not ready for was what he actually said. "The hands eat at 6, breakfast at 5, if you're doing that too, which I'll need you to do. The kitchen's big enough." He looked at Nathan. "Boy, can you work?" Nathan stood up straighter. "Yes, sir. I've got fence that needs checking after the last wind. You'll go with Ed tomorrow morning." He looked at Lillian, seemed to consider saying something, then didn't. He looked at Oliver. "There are no dogs," he said. "There's a cat. She doesn't like people." Oliver's face fell slightly. Then he said, "Maybe she'll like me." Ethan Whitmore turned and walked toward the house. "Come inside," he said without looking back. "It's cold." Adeline exhaled. She hadn't known she'd been holding her breath. She followed him, and her children followed her, and the gate they had walked through stayed open behind them, which felt like something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The kitchen was, as advertised, big. It had the look of a room that had been designed well and then slowly abandoned, the right equipment, the right layout, but the particular dullness of a space that had not been cared about in some time. The stove was good iron, heavy and capable. The shelves were stocked adequately. There was a smell of old coffee and dried herbs that had given up most of their character. Adeline set her bag down and looked at it the way she looked at all problems, like something that could be solved with enough attention. Ethan had stopped in the doorway. He was watching her look at the kitchen. "What's wrong with it?" he said. "Nothing's wrong with it," she said. "It just needs to know someone cares." He made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. "There are 2 rooms at the end of the hall. Small. You'll have to share." "That's fine." "The arrangement is temporary," he said. "You understand that?" "I understand what you're saying," Adeline answered, and she said it evenly, without challenge, but in a way that left the future somewhat open. He stood there for another moment, then nodded once and left. Nathan appeared at Adeline's elbow. "Did he just hire us?" he said quietly. "I believe he did." "He doesn't seem—" Nathan paused, choosing words. "Happy about it." No, Adeline agreed, but he did it anyway. She picked up her bag again and handed Nathan a smaller one. Start figuring out which room is bigger. Oliver gets the inside wall. The first night at Silver Creek Ranch, Adeline cooked a meal that she did not overcomplicate. She had been cooking for too long to believe that showing off was the same as cooking well. She made a beef stew from what she found in the kitchen: dried beans, salted beef, onions, a handful of herbs that still had some life in them, flour for thickening. She made bread from scratch in the time she had before the hands came in. The men filed into the dining room at 6 without much ceremony. There were 7 of them, ranch hands ranging from a boy younger than Nathan to a grizzled man named Ed, who sat at the end of the table and said nothing to anyone. They looked at the food with the wariness of people who had been disappointed before. Ethan sat at the head of the table. He had washed and changed his coat, but was otherwise exactly the same. Large, quiet, taking up space without seeming to require acknowledgement for it. Adeline served the stew and the bread and stood back. Nobody said anything for a moment. They ate. Then Ed, at the end of the table, set down his spoon, picked up his bread, tore it, and said, "Well." He didn't add anything to that. He just said well in a tone that communicated everything. The other men ate faster. Someone asked for more bread before the first helping was gone. A younger hand named Pete, who couldn't have been 17, looked up at Adeline with an expression of genuine personal gratitude that made her want to laugh. Ethan said nothing. But he finished everything in his bowl, and he did not leave the table until the bread was gone. That night, when the house had gone quiet and the children were asleep in the small room at the end of the hall, Adeline sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and took stock of where she was. She was in a house that had not decided yet if it wanted her. She was in a state that had not decided yet if it would kill her. She had $4.11 left to her name, which felt like a detail that mattered less than it had this morning, though she wasn't sure she could explain why. She had a job that had been described as temporary by a man who seemed to mean it. She sat with all of that and did not feel hopeful, exactly. Hopeful was too light a word for what she felt. She felt something more like determination. The specific, unglamorous kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't arrive with any particular feeling of courage, that just means you get up in the morning and do the next thing, and then the next one, and you don't stop. She rinsed the cup, set it on the shelf, and went to bed. In the morning, she was at the stove by 4:30. The days that followed were not easy and were not meant to be. The ranch ran on a schedule that had been refined over years into something close to military, and Adeline had to learn it fast or she would spend every day behind it. Breakfast at 5 for the hands, who came in cold and ate in 7 minutes and were gone. The main house to manage, Ethan's study, which she did not enter beyond the doorway, the rooms she was responsible for, the laundry that had to be done by hand and dried near the stove because there was nowhere outside that wouldn't freeze it solid. Lunch preparations in the gap between breakfast and the noon hour. Dinner at 6, which was the largest meal and the one that mattered most. She worked with a quietness that was not submissiveness but attention. She learned the kitchen the way she had always learned new things, by paying close attention to what it already was before she tried to change it. Nathan left with Ed every morning and came back in the evenings with new calluses and an expression of tired satisfaction that Adeline recognized. He was learning something. He was being used, which for a boy who had watched his father die and felt helpless through all of it, was exactly what he needed. Lillian, in the hours she wasn't helping Adeline, found the household accounts. She hadn't been invited to. She had simply been sitting near the kitchen one afternoon when Ethan had left a ledger on the table and gone outside, and Lillian had looked at it the way she looked at all numbers, like a language she spoke natively. When Ethan came back in, Lillian was still looking at it. He stopped, looked at her, looked at the ledger. "That's not for," he started. "You're being overcharged on the grain supply," Lillian said without looking up, "and you've been paying the same invoice twice for the equipment maintenance. I can see it right here. Same date, same amount, 2 entries. She looked up then. "How long has this been going on?" Ethan stood very still. "I'm sorry," Lillian said, registering his expression, and she started to close the ledger. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said, "How did you—" "I like numbers," Lillian said simply. "They're honest." He looked at her with an expression that Adeline, watching from the doorway, couldn't quite classify. It was somewhere between unsettled and something that was edging toward respect. He took the ledger and went to his study and came back 2 hours later with a different expression. He sat down at the kitchen table, not a thing he usually did, and said to Adeline, "Your daughter found a discrepancy in my accounts." "She tends to find things," Adeline said. "How much is it worth?" He seemed to be asking more generally than specifically. "Depends what you mean by worth," Adeline said. He looked at her. Then he said, "More than I thought," in a tone that wasn't about money anymore, and he went back to his study. Adeline watched him go. There was something in the man, she was becoming sure of it, that hadn't hardened all the way through. The hardness was real. The distance was real. But underneath it was someone who had chosen distance rather than grown into it naturally, and those were different things. A man who had grown cold would not be bothered by a 6-year-old's question about loneliness. A man who had chosen distance would. Oliver, in the meantime, was working on the cat. Her name, according to Ed, who seemed to know things about the ranch without being asked, was Martha. She was gray and enormous and spent most of her time in the barn, where she had an established territory and opinions about it. She had tolerated the presence of humans in her barn for years in the specific way that cats tolerate most things, with the clear implication that the situation could change at any time. Oliver went to the barn every day and sat near where Martha usually was and talked to her. He did not try to touch her. He did not try to move closer. He just sat and talked, the way he talked to most things, earnestly, about whatever was on his mind, treating her like a person who happened to have a different opinion about conversation than most people. Ed watched this for 3 days. On the 4th day, he walked past the barn and saw Oliver sitting in the hay with Martha in his lap, both of them apparently content. And he stopped and looked at this for a long moment, and then walked back to the bunkhouse and said, "That kid got the cat to sit with him." Nobody believed him. He brought 2 of the other hands back to look. "Well," one of them said, which was the same thing Ed had said about the stew, and which seemed to be the ranch's general expression for things that defied expectation. Ethan heard about this from Ed, which meant he heard it third hand and with characteristic understatement. Ed said only, "The boy's been sitting with Martha." He said it like it was a weather report. That evening, Ethan came to the barn. Oliver was there, the cat still tolerating him, talking to her about something Ethan couldn't quite follow. Something about the creek and whether the ice was thick enough to walk on and whether she had ever tried it. Ethan stood in the barn doorway for a moment. "Has she always been mean?" Oliver asked, without turning around, as if he'd known Ethan was there. "Mostly," Ethan said. "I don't think she's mean," Oliver said. "I think she's careful." Ethan looked at the cat, then at the boy. Then he said, "There's a difference?" "Being mean is when you want to hurt people," Oliver said with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old delivering a philosophy. "Being careful is when you don't want to get hurt." He said it without any awareness that it might apply to anyone other than the cat. Ethan stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the house, and if his face did something in the dark of the barn doorway, there was no one to see it. The days were building into something, though none of them could have said exactly what. The arrangement that was supposed to be temporary was putting down roots in the specific, unconscious way that things do when they're not being watched carefully, in the small accumulations of routine, in the way Nathan started anticipating what Ed needed before Ed asked for it, in the way the kitchen began to smell like a kitchen that was being used rather than maintained. Victor Hale came by on a Saturday. Adeline was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and she came to the window out of habit. She recognized him, the set of his shoulders in the saddle, the way he sat on a horse like he was doing the horse a favor. Ethan went out to meet him. The conversation was short. She couldn't hear it, but she could see enough to read something of it. Ethan standing at the bottom of the porch steps with his arms crossed, Victor still on his horse, doing the thing he had done in town of using the height differential as a conversational advantage. When Victor left, Ethan stood in the yard for a moment looking at where he'd gone. Then he came back inside. He came through the kitchen and stopped. "That man was in town when you came through," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Adeline said. "What did he say to you?" She thought about it. "He said you'd send me away." Ethan was quiet. "He offered me work," Adeline said. at half your rate." "What did you say?" "I said thank you and kept walking." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Hale owns the land east of here. We have a dispute about water rights that's been going on for 2 years." She hadn't asked. He told her anyway. "He comes here sometimes," Ethan continued, "to remind me that he thinks he's winning." "Is he?" Adeline asked. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not amusement exactly, but the ghost of it. "No," he said. "Not yet." He went back to whatever he had been doing. Adeline turned back to the stove. Outside, the wind was picking up again from the north, and the sky above the mountains had taken on the specific gray-white color that the ranch hands had started pointing to in the mornings and discussing in low, careful tones. The kind of color that meant something was coming, the kind of color that Montana wore before it showed you what it was really capable of. Nathan came in from the barn that evening with ice in his eyebrows and said, "Ed says there's a big storm coming." "How big?" Adeline asked. Nathan looked at her. He had the look of a boy who was learning to take things seriously without becoming afraid of them, which was a difficult balance, and he was managing it imperfectly, the way you do when you're 15 and the world keeps insisting on being larger than you expected. "Ed said," he answered carefully, "the biggest he's seen in 10 years. Adeline nodded. She went to the shelves and started counting what they had. The ranch was not fully prepared. She could see that immediately. There was enough for a week, maybe a little more if she was careful. But a storm big enough that Ed, who was not a man who used words carelessly, described it the way he had, could last longer than that, and could change what was possible in ways that food alone couldn't solve. She went to find Ethan. He was in his study, which was the one room in the house she still approached with some formality. She knocked on the open door frame. He looked up. "Ed says there's a storm coming," she said. "I know. I've looked at the stores. We may need more." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, and the size of him in the small study was suddenly more present, not threatening, just real. He was a man who had been carrying the weight of this property alone for a long time, and for a moment she could see all of it. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said. "The children and I can help with preparations here," she said. "Nathan and I can work on the meat stores. Lillian can help with the fuel count. Oliver," she paused. "Oliver will probably help the cat." He almost smiled. She was almost certain of it. "All right," he said. She turned to go. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She stopped. "You were right about the kitchen," he said. "It knows someone cares." She didn't turn around. She just nodded once and walked back down the hall, and she did not let herself think about the specific sound of a man's voice when he says something he didn't plan to say. She had work to do. The storm was coming, and none of them yet understood how much it would change everything. Ethan left for town before daylight. Adeline heard him go. The creak of the floorboards, the back door, the horse in the yard. She was already awake, had been awake since 4, lying in the narrow bed in the small room at the end of the hall, listening to the wind work itself up against the eaves. It had a different sound now than it had 2 days ago. 2 days ago, it had been wind. Now it was something with intention. She got up and started the stove. The hands came in for breakfast quieter than usual. Ed sat at his end of the table and ate without his usual economy of motion. He was slower this morning, more deliberate, like a man thinking through a list. Pete, the youngest hand, kept looking out the window at the sky, which had gone the color of old pewter in the pre-dawn dark. Nobody said much. The storm was the conversation, even when nobody was having it. Nathan came down while the hands were still eating. He had dressed already, which meant he'd been awake too. He sat at the far end of the table and accepted the plate Adeline set in front of him and looked at Ed. "What do we need to do?" he asked. Ed looked at him across the table. There was a pause, the kind that wasn't dismissive but was assessing. Ed was a man who had been on ranches his whole life and had opinions about boys who thought they were ready for things before they were. He had been changing his opinion about Nathan Harper slowly and without announcing it over the past week. "After you eat," Ed said, "come find me in the barn." Nathan nodded and ate faster. Adeline watched this and felt something she couldn't quite name. Pride, yes, but also the specific anxiety of watching your child step into a world that could hurt him and knowing that the only thing you can do is let him. She went back to the kitchen. Lillian appeared 20 minutes later with the household account ledger that Ethan had, apparently without formal discussion, left accessible to her. She set it on the table and opened it and began looking at the fuel entries with the same focused quiet she brought to everything numerical. Oliver came down last, found a piece of bread, asked where the cat was, and went to the barn. The morning moved in that compressed, purposeful way that mornings move when weather is coming and everyone knows it. Adeline made a full inventory of the kitchen. She did it methodically, writing on a piece of paper in a hand that was smaller and neater than her handwriting usually was. She had learned to conserve paper years ago, and the habit stayed. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, the salted beef, the root vegetables in the cold cellar, the preserved goods on the high shelf. She added it up and looked at the numbers and thought about 8 ranch hands and 4 more people and however many days a serious Montana blizzard could close a road. The numbers were not comfortable. Ethan had said he'd go to town. She trusted that. What she wasn't certain of was whether he'd know what to get, or rather, whether the list of what a working kitchen needed in a storm matched what a man who had been eating minimally for 3 years would think to buy. She wrote out a second list. Specific, detailed, with quantities. She set it on the table by the door where he'd see it when he came back. Then she went to work on what could be done here. The bread that could be baked now and stored, the dried goods that could be moved from the outbuilding to the kitchen where they'd be accessible if the yard became impassable. She worked with the particular speed of someone who had learned that preparation was not pessimism, but respect for what was coming. She was elbow deep in bread dough when she heard the argument. It started outside near the barn, and at first she thought it was 2 of the hands. Some disagreement about the storm preparations, the kind of friction that happened when men were stressed and tired and working close together. But then she heard Nathan's voice, and she went still. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. Nathan's voice doing the thing it did when he was trying to hold himself together, that particular strain that meant he was angry, but was aware that he wasn't supposed to show it. She wiped her hands and went to the door. Victor Hale's horse was in the yard again. He had not come to see Ethan this time. He was standing near the barn door talking to Nathan, and 2 men she didn't recognize were on horses behind him. Nathan was standing with a pitchfork in his hands, not threateningly, just because he'd been working, and his posture had the rigid uprightness of someone who knew that whatever he did next was going to be noted and judged. Adeline came down the porch steps. Victor saw her before she reached them. His expression shifted slightly. Not concern, but the recalibration of a man who had been saying something he'd prefer certain people not hear. "Mrs. Harper," he said pleasantly, too pleasantly. "Mr. Hale," she said. She stopped a few feet away from Nathan and looked at the 2 men on horses, then back at Victor. "Can I help you with something?" "Just came to check on things," Victor said. "Storm coming. Thought I'd see how Ethan's managing." "He's in town," Adeline said. "Is he?" Victor looked at Nathan, then back at her. Funny thing, leaving a ranch in the hands of a woman and a boy the day before a storm like this. Nathan's jaw tightened. Adeline put a hand briefly on his arm, not to hold him back, just to acknowledge she'd heard it too. "The ranch is being managed fine," she said. "I'm sure it is." Victor's pleasantness did not waver, which was the unpleasant thing about it. It was the pleasantness of a man who had decided he had already won something. "I was saying to the boy here, there's a section of the east fence line that borders my property. The wind last week did some damage. I'd hate for Ethan's cattle to wander onto my land during the storm. Be ashamed to have to deal with that dispute on top of everything else." It was a very carefully constructed sentence. Adeline heard all of it. "I'll let Ethan know about the fence," she said. "You do that." Victor looked around the yard. His eyes landed briefly on the house, then on Adeline, with an expression she had seen before on men who had decided she was a piece on a board rather than a person at the table. "How are you finding it here?" he asked. "The arrangement. I find it suits us," Adeline said. "Temporary thing, though, isn't it?" He said it lightly. "Man like Ethan, set in his ways. Hard to imagine this lasting." "Most things last longer than people expect," Adeline said, "when they're built right." Victor smiled. "Well, give Ethan my regards." He mounted his horse with the practiced ease of someone who wanted the mounting to look effortless, and he and his 2 men rode out of the yard. Nathan let out a long breath. I almost said something. I know, Adeline said. He was doing it on purpose, talking to me like I was. I know what he was doing. She looked at him. What did he actually say before I came out? Nathan's face did something complicated. He said that after the storm, Ethan was going to have to think seriously about what was practical. He said having a family here was a liability and that any reasonable man would see that. He paused. He said it like he was being helpful. Adeline was quiet for a moment, watching the road where Victor had gone. Come help me move the grain sacks before your hands freeze, she said. They worked. The morning burned down toward noon. Ed had the ranch hands pulling double work, checking the water lines, moving the cattle into the sheltered pastures, reinforcing the barn doors against the kind of wind that could rip them from their hinges. Adeline worked the kitchen and the cold cellar. Lillian, having finished with the accounts, appeared at the cellar stairs and started handing things up without being asked, which was so like her that Adeline didn't even comment on it. Ethan got back mid-afternoon with the wagon loaded higher than Adeline had expected. He had used her list. She could see that immediately. The specific items, the quantities. He had also added things she hadn't thought to list, which told her something about him she filed away without comment. He was not a man who worked from only what he was given. The hands unloaded the wagon. Ethan came inside. He found Adeline's note about the fence line. She had left it on his desk after Victor's visit, written out clearly with the East property coordinates that Ed had given her. He read it, and his expression did the tight, controlled thing it did when he was containing something. When was he here? Ethan said. This morning, after you left. What did he say to Nathan? Adeline told him, plainly, without embellishment. Ethan was quiet for a longer moment than usual. He set the note down. Then he said, That fence line is not damaged. Adeline looked at him. The wind last week didn't reach the east pasture, he said. I wrote it 4 days ago. The fence is whole. The room was quiet. He was here to see what we had, Ethan said. And who was managing it? Adeline understood. Victor Hale had ridden out not to warn them about a fence, but to assess what Silver Creek Ranch looked like with Ethan gone, with a woman and a teenager in the yard, with the storm coming. He had wanted to know if there was a weakness. He had wanted to see if the unusual arrangement had left the property vulnerable. What's he actually after? Adeline asked. The water rights? The creek runs along the boundary, Ethan said. His land is drier than mine. He's been claiming the water table on his side is fed by the same source as my creek, which would give him legal standing to divert it. 2 years I've been documenting that claim as false. I have surveys. I have water level records going back 8 years. He stopped. He knows he's losing the legal argument, so he's been trying other things. What other things? Buying up the goodwill of people in town who might be inclined to speak against me, waiting for me to make a mistake that would make me look unstable or poorly managed. He looked at her. Inviting me to look unstable by accepting a widow and 3 children into my household in the middle of winter. There it was, said plainly. Adeline looked at him and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. Do you regret it? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man avoiding the question, but one genuinely working out the honest answer. No, he said. I don't. He picked up his coat and went back outside. Adeline stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went back to the stove because the hands would need to eat before dark, and the bread needed to come out, and there was still a long afternoon's worth of work before anyone in this house could rest. The sky changed color at around 3 in the afternoon, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a slow, definitive shift, like a door closing in another room. The gray went darker and more uniform, and the wind, which had been coming in gusts, settled into something steadier and colder. Ed came in from the barn, stamped the snow off his boots, and said to no one in particular, "Tonight." Everyone heard him. Dinner that evening was different from the others. There was no specific change in how people sat or ate, but the room had the quality of a ship's cabin before a crossing. People quieter with their thoughts, eating with more attention, the way you do when you know that the ordinary act of a warm meal at a table is about to become something you might not take for granted for a while. Ethan sat at the head of the table and ate and said very little, which was normal, but his eyes moved around the room in a way they didn't usually, taking account the way a man does when he's responsible for a lot of things and wants to know where they all are. Oliver sat next to Pete, which had become his customary seat in the past week. Pete was young enough to treat Oliver more like a small companion than a nuisance, and Oliver had responded to this with the wholehearted loyalty that 6-year-olds give to people who take them seriously. He was telling Pete about something Martha the cat had done that morning, and Pete was listening with apparent genuine interest. Ethan watched this for a moment. Then he looked at Nathan, who was sitting straight and eating, and had the look of a boy who had spent the day doing real work and had not complained about any of it. "Good day," Ethan said. Nathan looked up. The question had been so unexpected, Ethan didn't make conversation at the table as a rule, that he took a second to respond. "Yes, sir," he said. "Ed had me checking the water line to the south pasture. I found a split in the pipe about 40 feet from the trough." "Did you fix it?" "Yes, sir. Ed showed me how." Ethan nodded. He looked at Ed. Ed said, "He found it before I did," which, from Ed, was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Nathan tried not to look too pleased about this and failed moderately. After dinner, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the children had been sent to bed, Oliver protesting briefly and then subsiding with the speed of genuine exhaustion, Adeline was cleaning the kitchen and Ethan was still at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold some time ago. She noticed he hadn't left. She kept working because there was still work to do, and because she had learned in the past week that Ethan Whitmore sometimes needed the proximity of ordinary activity to say things that were otherwise difficult for him to say. After a while he said, "My wife's name was Clara." Adeline slowed slightly but didn't stop. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "Fever. Same as your husband, I imagine. It's not a kind way to go." "No," Adeline said. "It isn't." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She was the one who knew how to make this place feel like somewhere to live rather than somewhere to work. "After she was gone, He stopped, looked at the table. "I let it become what it wanted to be." Adeline didn't say anything. She knew enough about grief to know that some things needed to be said and not answered. "When Oliver asked me that," Ethan said, "whether I was the man who lived alone. I've thought about that." "Children ask things directly," Adeline said. "Yes, they do." He was quiet for a moment. "The answer is yes. I have been." He said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. "I don't know if I was choosing it or just letting it happen. There might not be a difference." The kitchen was quiet except for the wind, which was building steadily outside. "When Thomas died," Adeline said, without really planning to, "the first week I kept thinking about all the things I should have said, all the things I'd saved for later because there was going to be a later." She put a dish on the shelf. "Then I realized that the thing I most wished I'd done differently was just being present, being in the same room as him without always doing something. I was always doing something." Ethan was looking at her now. "I still am," she said, with the small, honest self-awareness of someone who had made peace with a flaw rather than fixed it. "I'm still always doing something." He almost smiled. She was sure of it this time. He stood up, put the cold coffee cup in the basin, and said, "Storm will be here by morning. Wake the children early if it comes in hard. The east bedroom window has a gap in the frame that lets air in. I've meant to fix it for 2 years. "I'll put something against it," she said. He nodded and walked down the hall. Adeline stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. She finished the last of the cleaning, banked the stove to hold heat through the night, and checked the door seals. Then she stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the yard, where the snow was beginning to come down in the specific, relentless way of a storm that has committed to itself. She had come to this gate with $4.11 and 3 children and the stubbornness of a woman who had decided that necessity and forward motion were the same thing. She had not expected the man behind the gate to be someone she could talk to in the dark of a kitchen without it feeling like anything other than 2 people in the same house during the same storm. She hadn't expected that, and she wasn't sure what to do with it yet. What she did was go to bed. She checked on the children. Oliver burrowed into his blankets, Lillian curled with her arm over the edge of the bed in the way she always slept, Nathan on his back with his arm over his eyes, already deeply gone. She put a folded blanket against the gap in the east window frame. She listened to the wind for a moment. Then she went to her room and lay down and was asleep within minutes, which was a skill she had developed out of pure survival. When you have children and too much to do and not enough hours, you learn to sleep fast and completely. Outside, the storm arrived. Not with drama, it didn't announce itself. It simply deepened the way serious things do. The wind went from 30 miles an hour to 50 without a moment of ceremony. The snow thickened and blew horizontal, and the temperature dropped in a way that the thermometer outside the barn registered in numbers that Ed, checking it before dawn, looked at and then looked away from without saying anything. Adeline woke at 4:30 as usual, and the world outside was white and loud. She dressed, added a sweater under her coat, and went to the kitchen. The stove had held through the night, but the kitchen was colder than it should have been. Cold was coming in somewhere, through some gap in the construction that hadn't mattered until now. She built up the fire and stood close to it while it grew and listened to the storm doing everything it had promised it would do. Nathan appeared. He had gotten up without being called, which she noticed. "Is it as bad as Ed said?" he asked. "Go look at the front window," she told him. He went and came back. "Oh," he said. "Yes," she said. The hands came in for breakfast in twos and threes, fighting the door against the wind each time, bringing cold in with them that took minutes to dissipate. Their faces were red before they'd been outside 30 seconds. Ed came last and reported, with his characteristic compression of language, that the east fence was holding, the cattle were in the shelter pasture, the barn was sound, and the water line Nathan had fixed the day before was the only line still fully functional in the south section. Nathan heard this from the kitchen doorway and stood a little straighter. Ethan came down and stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked at Adeline's inventory list on the table, and then out the window and then at the list again. "How long does it need to last?" Adeline asked. "If it's what Ed thinks it is," Ethan said, 3 days minimum, could be 5. She looked at her numbers. "We're fine for 5 if we're careful." "We'll be careful," he said. The morning was organized chaos. Adeline coordinated the kitchen, calculating how to stretch the provisions without making anyone feel it, a skill she'd had years to develop. Lillian appeared with the fuel log and quietly pointed out that if the storm ran 5 days, they needed to be more conservative with the stove in the rooms that weren't in active use. Ethan, when he heard this, looked at Lillian the way he had the first time she'd shown him the ledger, with that expression that sat between unsettled and reluctant respect. "The guest room at the north end," he said. "Shut it. No one's in it." "I already noted that," Lillian said, and showed him the log where she had already marked 3 rooms to reduce. He looked at the log, then at her. "Do you want to be a bookkeeper?" he said. Lillian considered this seriously, which was how she considered all things. "I want to understand how things work," she said. "Numbers are how things work, mostly." Ethan said nothing, but he let her keep the fuel log. By midday, the storm had settled into something that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a condition. There was no outside anymore. Not really. There was the barn, accessible through 15 feet of wind and snow, and there was the house, and between them was something you had to decide to cross. The men made the crossing when they had to, in pairs, always with one hand on the guide rope Ed had strung between the barn door and the back porch before the storm hit, because he had been through this before and knew that people died in Montana storms walking the 30 feet between 2 buildings they knew by heart. Adeline kept the kitchen going. It was the center of the house in a way that wasn't symbolic but entirely practical. The stove was the heat source, the food was the morale, and both required constant attention. She fell into a rhythm that was demanding and oddly clarifying, the way extreme circumstances sometimes are. This is what matters. This is what needs doing. Do it. In the middle of the afternoon, Oliver came to find her. He stood in the kitchen doorway with a look on his face that was trying to be calm and was not fully succeeding. "Martha's in the barn," he said. "I know," Adeline said. "She'll be okay," he said. "Right?" Adeline looked at her son. He had been quiet all day, more quiet than usual, which for Oliver was noticeable. She had attributed it to the storm's weight on the house, the way even children feel the pressure of bad weather as something more than cold. "Cats are tough," she said. "She has the barn, she has the hay. She'll be warmer than she looks." Oliver nodded. He came and stood near the stove. "Is this the worst storm there is?" he asked. "I don't know," Adeline said. "Ed says it's the worst in 10 years. Were we here 10 years ago?" "No, we were in Virginia." "Was it different?" "Very different." He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "I like it here," he said. Then, as if he felt the need to explain, "Even with the storm, I like the barn, and I like Pete, and I like that the sky is so big." He looked up at her. "Is this home now?" Adeline kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on what she was doing. "We'll see," she said, because it was the most honest thing she could offer. Then, because he was 6 and honest deserved a little more than that, "I think it might be." Oliver seemed to settle with that. He found a spot near the stove and sat down on the kitchen floor. Not in the way, just near the warmth, and Adeline let him stay. Ethan came through the kitchen an hour later, stopped when he saw Oliver on the floor, and looked at Adeline. "He's not in the way," she said. Ethan looked at Oliver, who looked back at him with the equanimity of a child who had decided that Ethan Whitmore was not a threat and had adjusted all his behavior accordingly. "You could sit at the table," Ethan said. "The floor's warmer," Oliver said. "The heat comes down." Ethan looked at the floor, then at the stove, then at the ceiling. He appeared to be running some physics in his head. "That's not—" He stopped. "Actually, that's probably right." Oliver nodded, satisfied. Ethan got his coffee and left. But when he came back through 20 minutes later, he looked at Oliver again, and this time there was something in his face that was neither irritation nor amusement, but something that sat quietly between them. Evening came early, the way it does in Montana winter, and comes even earlier in a storm. By 4 o'clock, the light outside was failing. By 5, it was full dark, and the wind had found a new pitch that made the house feel smaller. Dinner was the best meal Adeline had managed since they arrived, not because she had more to work with, but because she understood by now what these men needed, which wasn't just food, but the specific comfort of something familiar being done well. She made a pot roast with the last of the good beef, slow-cooked since morning, with potatoes and turnips and a gravy that used the drippings properly. She made more bread. She made a dried apple thing that wasn't quite a pie, but tried hard. The hands came in from the barn looking like they had been in a fight with the weather, and the weather had scored some points. They sat down and the smell hit them, and some of them actually stopped for a second, which was something Adeline had never seen grown men do in front of food. Pete said, quietly but sincerely, "Mrs. Harper, I'm going to tell my mother about you." Several of the other hands made sounds of agreement. Ethan said nothing, but he looked up from his plate once across the table at Adeline and held the look for just a moment before looking back down. After dinner, when the children were in bed and the hands were back in the bunkhouse, and the house was as quiet as it got with a blizzard against the windows, Ethan was at the table again. Adeline made tea. Not coffee this time. She'd been awake since 4, and coffee at this hour would cost her in the morning, and set a cup for him without being asked, and sat down. He looked at the cup, then at her. "You sat down," he said. "I'm tired," she said. "I'll stand again in a minute." He almost smiled. She had now accumulated several of these near smiles in her mental ledger, and she had begun to understand that for Ethan Whitmore, something that got that close to a smile was not a small thing. They sat with the tea and the sound of the storm, and after a while Ethan said, "Victor Hale is going to make a move after the storm. I know him well enough to know that. He's patient, and he's been watching for an opening." "What kind of move?" Adeline asked. "He has a meeting scheduled with the county land office in February. He's going to present his water rights claim officially. If he can show that Silver Creek Ranch has been mismanaged, legally, financially, or in terms of reputation, it undermines my counterclaim. Makes me look like a man who can't maintain his own property, let alone argue water access against a bigger operation." Adeline thought about this. Lillian found the double billing. Yes. How much? Over 2 years, close to $400. Adeline held her teacup. Who was doing the billing? My supply agent in Garrison, a man named Torrance. He handles accounts for several operations in the valley. Ethan's jaw was tight. Including Victor Hale's. The room was very quiet. You think they're connected, Adeline said. I think it's worth asking. Lillian could go through the entire accounts ledger, Adeline said. Everything from the past 3 years. If there's a pattern... She's 13, Ethan said, but he said it without much conviction. She's 13 and she found what you missed, Adeline said, not unkindly. I'm not saying she does it alone. I'm saying she'd probably find things faster than anyone else. He sat with that. The survey records, he said after a moment. The water level documentation. I've kept it all in the study. If there's a way to put it in order, a way a land office committee could actually follow without needing to understand the technical side, that's a different kind of work, Adeline said. That's organization and presentation. Yes, I can do that, she said. He looked at her. Not the assessing look from the gate, or the formal look from the early days. This was different. This was the look of a man seeing someone clearly. Why? He said. She considered the question honestly. Because you let us in, she said, when you didn't have to, when every practical reason said not to. She set down her tea. That's the kind of thing you pay back. The storm hammered the house. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the cattle were in their shelter, and the guide rope was holding, and the barn was standing, and the fence lines that mattered were intact. Ethan said, "All right." He didn't say thank you. She didn't need him to. They understood each other in the specific way that people understand each other when they are in the same situation, working toward the same thing, without any confusion about what it costs and why it matters. Adeline finished her tea. She stood, because there was still something to do. There was always something to do. And she checked the stove and moved to the hallway. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She stopped. He had said her name twice now, in circumstances where it wasn't necessary. She had noticed both times. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be longer." She said goodnight and went down the hall. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm, and thought about surveys and account ledgers, and a man who had built a gate that he closed against the world, and then, on a frozen morning, had simply left it open when it mattered. Outside the window, the snow fell in absolute sheets, erasing the landmarks, erasing the road, erasing everything that wasn't Silver Creek Ranch. And inside the house, in the specific warmth of a stove that had been properly banked, and a kitchen that had been properly stocked, and rooms that had been properly closed against the cold. The people who had come here separately, and without a plan were finding out, slowly and without anyone announcing it, that they had become something. Not a family yet. Not quite. But not strangers anymore either. Something in between that didn't have a clean name, but that the storm was pressing them toward, the way pressure changes the shape of things that are still deciding what they want to be. The storm did not ease in the night the way storms sometimes do, building to a peak and then slowly releasing, as if reconsidering. This one held its intensity through the dark hours and was, if anything, more committed by morning than it had been at midnight. Adeline knew this before she opened her eyes, just from the sound of it. There was a register to serious weather that ordinary wind didn't have, a kind of fullness like a note held past the point where you expected it to stop. She was at the stove by 4:15. The kitchen was cold in a way it hadn't been the previous 2 mornings. Not dangerously cold, but the kind that told her the storm had found more gaps than the walls were ready for. She built up the fire and stood close and waited for the room to decide it was willing to warm up. And while she waited, she thought about the day's food and the fuel log Lillian had been keeping and the survey documents Ethan had mentioned, which she had decided overnight that she would start organizing today if the storm gave the house any kind of rhythm to work within. Ed was the first one through the back door, at 20 minutes before 5. He came in with snow on every horizontal surface of his coat, and an expression that told her before he said anything that he'd been outside already. "Lost 2 fence posts on the south line," he said. "Nothing structural. The cattle are still in the shelter pasture." He accepted the coffee she handed him. "Wind's worse than yesterday. Nobody goes out alone today." "I'll tell Nathan," she said. "Already told him. He was in the barn when I got there." She looked at him. "He was already in the barn," Yes, ma'am. Ed drank his coffee. He's a good kid. Doesn't quit. From Ed, that was the same as an engraved commendation. The hands came in for breakfast in the compressed, purposeful way of people who understood that the day was going to demand more than usual and were conserving accordingly. They ate fast and talked less than usual. The young ones, Pete and a hand named Calloway, who was maybe 19, were doing that thing young men do before difficult work, making themselves quieter and more deliberate as if preparing for something. The older hands, Ed included, just ate. Ethan came down at 5:30, earlier than his usual hour. He had the look of a man who hadn't slept much but had used the sleeplessness productively. There was a focus about him, a gathered quality. He stood at the window with his coffee and looked out at what was there to see, which was mostly white and moving, and said, "We need to check the creek." Ed looked up. "The ice," Ethan said. "If it's backing up at the bend, it'll push water toward the south foundation. It's happened before." Ed set down his fork. "I'll go." "Not alone," Ethan said. "Nathan and I will go with you." Adeline said nothing. She wanted to say something. Nathan was 15. The wind was doing 50 miles an hour. The visibility was close to nothing. But she looked at her son, who was sitting straight and trying not to look like he was hoping to be included, and she understood that saying something would be the wrong thing. Nathan needed to be in the world that was asking something of him. Keeping him out of it to keep him safe was not actually keeping him safe. She put more food on his plate instead. Ethan caught her eye across the kitchen. He held it for a moment with an expression that said he understood what she hadn't said, and nodded once. She understood this to mean he would be careful, that Nathan would not be sent ahead of him, that he would not let the boy do something beyond what he could handle. She didn't know exactly how she understood all of that from a single nod, but she did. They went out after breakfast. Adeline watched from the window as the three of them crossed the yard. Ed in front, Ethan behind Nathan, all of them leaning into the wind at angles that should not have been sustainable. The guide rope was there, and they used it, hand over hand, until the barn swallowed them. The house was quieter with them gone, not empty. Lillian was at the kitchen table with the fuel log and the accounts ledger both open, cross-referencing something with the careful attention of a person who has found a thread and is following it without rushing. Oliver was on the kitchen floor near the stove because the physics had proven out yesterday, and he had decided this was simply where he sat now. Two of the hands who were not needed in the barn were in the main room, doing equipment maintenance, the sounds of it coming through the wall in small metallic rhythms. Adeline started on the survey documents. She had brought them out from Ethan's study the night before with his permission. 2 wooden boxes and a leather portfolio, 3 years of careful documentation of the creek's water levels, survey markers, property boundaries, and the ongoing correspondence with the county land office. She had looked at them briefly before bed and understood immediately what the problem was. The information was all there. Ethan had been meticulous, but it was organized in the order he had gathered it, which was chronological, and chronological was not the same as coherent to someone who didn't already understand the argument. She needed to reorganize it. She needed to build the case in the order that made the conclusion inevitable, not the order that reflected how the evidence was discovered. She was not a lawyer. She had not been educated beyond what a Virginia girl of her era could expect, which meant she could read well, write well, and reason carefully, which turned out to be most of what the job required. She spread the documents across the kitchen table. Lillian moved the ledgers to make room without being asked, and began. "What are those?" Lillian said. "The water rights documentation. Mr. Whitmore has a land office hearing in February. The documents need to be reorganized so the argument is clear." Lillian looked at the papers. "Can I help when I'm done with this?" "Yes," Adeline said. "I'll need someone to check the dates on the survey records." Lillian nodded and went back to the ledger. They worked. The storm worked outside. The stove worked between them. An hour into it, Lillian said, without looking up, "The double billing from Torrance didn't start until 18 months ago." Adeline looked up. "What started 18 months ago?" "That's when Victor Hale filed his first formal water rights complaint with the county." Lillian ran her finger down a column. 3 weeks after the filing, the first duplicate invoice appeared. Exactly. She looked up. That's probably not a coincidence. Adeline looked at her daughter, this girl who had been doing sums in her head since she could talk, who had learned to read a ledger the way some children learn to read stories, because numbers felt safer and more honest than most things. No, Adeline said. It probably isn't. If I can show the timing, Lillian said, and the amounts, and whose accounts Torrance handles, can you? Lillian looked at the ledger. Give me until this afternoon. They heard the back door before they saw anyone, a blast of cold air, and then the sound of boots, and then voices, one of them Nathan's. Adeline was at the door to the hallway before she'd consciously decided to move. They were all three back. Ed first, then Nathan, then Ethan, and all of them were covered in snow and moving with the stiffness of people who had been very cold for too long. But they were back, and they were upright, and Nathan was talking. The bend was backed up, he said to Adeline as he came in, because she was the first person he saw, and he understood without looking at her that she had been waiting. Not bad enough to threaten the foundation yet, but we broke it up. Ed had a pike in the barn, and we went at it for about 20 minutes. Adeline looked at Ethan over Nathan's head. Ethan said, "He did well." Nathan had the grace not to react to this too obviously. He went to stand by the stove, and the tips of his ears were red, and Adeline could not tell whether it was from the cold or from what Ethan had said, and she suspected Nathan couldn't either. Ed accepted coffee and sat down heavily. He was 60-something and had been working ranches since before Ethan Whitmore was born, and even he had the look of a man who had just been outside in something that had the better of him. Ethan changed his wet coat and came to the kitchen table. He saw the survey documents spread out and stopped. "I started organizing them," Adeline said, "by argument rather than date. I hope that's—" "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through the logic she'd applied, which documents established the original property boundary, which established the creek's historical course, which established the water table data, and how those three threads, presented in order, made the claim self-evident. He stood beside her and looked at what she had built. He was close enough that she was aware of the cold still coming off his coat, and aware that he was genuinely reading what she'd laid out rather than just acknowledging it. "This is better than how I had it," he said. "You knew the argument," she said. "You just organized it the way you found it." "That's what I said. This is better." Then Lillian appeared at his elbow, which startled him slightly because she moved quietly. She put the open ledger on the table beside the survey documents and pointed at the column she'd been working on. "The billing discrepancies begin 3 weeks after Mr. Hale's first water rights filing," she said. She was using her careful voice, the one she used when she'd found something she was confident about and wanted to present it correctly. "The amounts increase each quarter, and Torrance handles accounts for 4 other ranches in the valley. 2 of them are ranches that have had legal disputes with Silver Creek in the past 5 years. She looked at Ethan directly. "I don't know if that means anything legal, but it's a pattern." Ethan looked at the ledger. He looked at it for a long time. "How old are you?" he said. 13, Lillian said. "In Virginia, did they—" He stopped. "Did you go to school?" "Until we came west," she said. He was quiet. Then he said, "When we get to Garrison after the storm, I want you to come with me when I see my attorney." Lillian blinked. This was not a thing she had expected. "To bring the ledger?" "To explain what you found," Ethan said. "He'll understand it better coming from you than from me trying to restate it." Lillian looked at her mother. Adeline said, "That's Mr. Whitmore's decision." Lillian turned back to Ethan with the expression of someone who had just been given something they hadn't known to want. "All right," she said with careful composure. "I'll have it fully documented by tomorrow." She went back to the table and picked up her pencil. Ethan watched her go. Then he said quietly to Adeline, "She's remarkable." "I know," Adeline said, without false modesty, because it was true, and she had known it since Lillian was 4 years old and had corrected a merchant's change without being taught to. The storm entered its 3rd day, and the hours in it began to blur at the edges, the way time does in sustained difficult weather. There was no morning and afternoon in the usual sense. There was light that was gray and light that was darker gray and then dark. There was the stove and the food and the guide rope between the house and barn and the ongoing arithmetic of what they had and how long it needed to last. On the third afternoon, Pete came in from the barn with his left hand wrapped in a piece of cloth and the expression of someone who was trying to minimize something. Adeline saw it before he said anything. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Rope caught it," Pete said. "When the barn door—" "It's fine, it's not—" "Sit down," she said. He sat. She unwrapped the cloth. It was a bad rope burn across his palm, deep and raw, the kind that wouldn't threaten the hand but would make the next few days painful and the next few weeks impossible if it got infected. She cleaned it with the carbolic she kept in the kitchen medical tin. Pete made a sound through his teeth and looked at the ceiling, and wrapped it properly. "Keep it clean," she said. "If it goes red beyond the edges of the burn, you tell me immediately." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. He looked at his hand. "I've been more careful than this on worse days." "The rope was icy," she said. "It happens." He looked at her with the expression of a young man who had been bracing for a scolding and had received something else. "How do you know about burns like this?" "My husband worked with rope and timber," she said. "I learned what I needed to learn." He nodded. He seemed to want to say something else. After a moment, he said, "Is it true you walked all the way from Garrison with the kids?" "Yes." "In that cold?" "It was a cold morning," she said, setting the medical tin back on its shelf. Pete was quiet. Then he said, "Victor Hale told people in town you were going to be trouble for Mr. Whitmore." Adeline turned from the shelf. "When did you hear that?" "Before the storm. I go into town most Saturdays." He looked at his wrapped hand. "He said Mr. Whitmore was going soft, taking in charity." He paused. "The men I drink with, some of them are Hale's hands. They talk." "What do they say?" "That Hale thinks your being here is going to cost Mr. Whitmore at the land office hearing. That a judge or a committee or whoever decides these things is going to look at Ethan Whitmore and see a man who made a soft decision about a widow woman and figure he's not as sharp as he used to be." Pete looked up at her. "I don't think that. I just thought you should know what's being said." Adeline stood with that for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. He nodded and went back to the barn, navigating the cold with his good hand on the guide rope. She stood in the kitchen alone for a minute and thought about what it meant, that Victor Hale's strategy had more layers than just the legal argument. He wanted to reshape how people saw Ethan, and he had decided that Adeline herself was a useful tool for that reshaping. The presence of a widow and her children at Silver Creek Ranch, in Victor Hale's telling, was evidence of a weakness. A man who could be moved by a woman with nowhere to go was a man whose judgment could be questioned. It was a mean and intelligent strategy, and she had been so focused on what it meant for the water rights case that she had not fully considered what it meant for Ethan standing in the valley more broadly. She was still thinking about it when Ethan came in from the barn an hour later. He came in looking tired, not the tired of a man who needed sleep, but the tired of 3 days of managed crisis, the kind that accumulates in the muscles and the mind together. He went to the stove and stood near it and accepted the coffee she handed him. "Pete told me what Hale is saying in town," she said. Ethan looked at her. "About my being here costing you at the hearing," she said. "About how it looks." He said nothing. "I want you to think about whether—" she started. "No," he said. She stopped. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "I've thought about it. The answer is no." "Ethan." She had not used his first name before. She heard herself do it and did not take it back. "If my presence here is being used against you, then I'll answer it," he said. "I'll answer it with 8 years of water-level records and a 13-year-old who can walk a county committee through financial fraud better than any lawyer I've ever hired." He looked at her steadily. "You're not leaving. Don't ask me again." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and there was something in this moment that was different from all the previous ones. The late-night kitchen conversations, the quiet exchange of information and respect. This was something that had decided about itself. "All right," she said. He nodded and drank his coffee. Outside, without any warning that the people in the house could hear, something changed in the wind. It shifted direction, not by much, maybe 20 degrees, but enough that the sound of it against the house changed register. Ed, who was in the main room, looked up at the ceiling for no reason except that his body had registered the change before his mind had. "That's the turn," he said to no one in particular. Everyone who heard it understood. When a Montana blizzard turned, it usually meant the worst of it had passed its meridian. Still dangerous, still heavy, but the engine had shifted. It would come down from here. The problem was the timing of what happened next. At roughly 4 in the afternoon, Adeline was at the stove and Lillian was at the table, and the house had settled into the particular exhausted calm of late storm day 3, when they heard Ethan shout. Not loudly. Not a panicked shout. A sharp, controlled sound from outside that was specifically the sound of a man who has been hurt and is managing it, which is a different sound entirely, and somehow worse. Adeline was at the back door before she had thought about moving. Through the gap in the door she could see, through the driving snow, 2 figures, Ed in one of the other hands, moving toward the house from the direction of the barn. Between them, supported, was Ethan. She got the door fully open. They came in. Ethan was on his feet, but not fully. He was taking weight on one leg, and his left arm was pressed against his side in a way that was careful and deliberate. "What happened?" she said, and her voice was even because this was not a moment for anything other than even. "Beam in the barn," Ed said. "Wind got the east side and a support gave. He was under it when it went." "It hit his side," said the other hand, Calloway. "He got his arm up in time, but it caught him across the ribs." "I'm fine," Ethan said. "Sit down," Adeline said. "I don't need—" Ethan. She had used it once already today. She used it again with the same weight. "Sit down." He sat. She looked at his arm first, then had him lift his coat with help. His left side, when she pressed her fingers carefully along the rib cage, produced a breath from him that was sharp and controlled. The breath of a man who was accustomed to not showing pain and was working hard at it. "2, at least," she said. "Possibly 3. I can't tell without a doctor, but the way they're moving—" She pressed again gently. He breathed out through his nose. "Here and here." "Cracked?" Ed said. "Most likely. Possibly 1 broken." She looked at Ethan. "Have you had broken ribs before?" "Yes," he said. "Does this feel the same?" A pause. "Mostly," which meant it might be worse in at least 1 place. She looked at Ed. "There's a doctor in Garrison," Ed said. "Road's closed," Calloway said. "Road's not what it was," Ed said carefully. "Wind turned 20 minutes ago. By tomorrow morning—" "I'll be fine through the night," Ethan said. "It's ribs. They heal." "They heal wrong if you keep working on them," Adeline said. "And they can cause other problems if something's fully broken and moves." She looked at him directly. "You know this." He held her gaze. The pain was there if you looked. Not in his expression, which he was controlling, but in the set of his shoulders, the slight forward tilt that kept his left side from fully expanding. "I know," he said. She wrapped his ribs with strips of clean cloth from the linen she'd found in the storage closet. She had wondered at the time why there was so much of it, and now she understood that Claire had probably kept it for exactly this kind of use. She worked carefully, and he let her, which was itself a kind of concession she didn't comment on. Nathan was in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He was looking at Ethan with an expression that was young, younger than he usually allowed himself to look. Scared, but contained. Working at it. "He's all right," Adeline said. "Ribs." Nathan nodded. He stayed in the doorway. Ethan looked at him. "The east side of the barn needs 1 more support, or the whole thing could shift further if the wind picks up again tonight. Ed knows where the timber is." Nathan straightened. "I'll go with him." "Not until I'm done here," Adeline said. "I can—" "Nathan." She looked at him. 10 minutes. He waited 10 minutes. Then he went back out with Ed into the darkening storm, and Adeline knew she had done the right thing by letting him go, and also knew that it cost her something, and that the cost was reasonable, and that this was simply what it meant to have a son who was becoming a man. Ethan was at the kitchen table. He had refused the chair with the arms in favor of the straight-backed one, which told her his left side hurt more when he was supported. The support was putting pressure on it. She made him tea. He did not argue about the tea. After a while he said, "I need to tell you something about the property." She looked at him. If the hearing goes against me in February, he stopped. If Hale wins the water rights claim, it doesn't just affect the creek. The creek feeds the south pasture and 2 of the outbuildings. If I lose the right to control that water, I lose the ability to run cattle in that section, which is about 1/3 of the operation. Adeline set down her cup. I'm telling you, he said, because you're organizing the documents. You should understand what's at stake and why it's not just a legal inconvenience. How long have you been worried about this? She said. Since the first filing. He looked at the table. I've been carrying it alone. I don't... He stopped again. There was something in the stopping that was effortful. I don't share things easily. I know, she said. Claire used to say that. He said it without bitterness. She said I'd carry a mountain alone rather than ask for a handcart. She was right, Adeline said, the ghost of that almost smile. Yes, he said. She usually was. They sat with that for a moment. The particular company of 2 people who had each lost someone, who understood without having to explain it that grief was not a thing you finished, but a thing you learned to carry differently over time. You're not alone with it now, Adeline said. She said it plainly, without sentiment, because that was how she meant it. Lillian has the ledger. I have the documents. You have Ed and Nathan holding the barn up right now. You're not alone with any of it. Ethan looked at her. The pain was still there in the careful way he held himself. But something else was there too. Something that was working through him slowly, like heat through a cold room. I know, he said. It was the same 2 words he'd said before, but they meant something different this time. Outside, the wind turned another degree. The sound of it against the house shifted again. Not calmer yet, not by any means, but different. Somewhere in its sustained roar was the first intimation of something that was going to eventually be called afterwards. Nathan and Ed came back from the barn in the early dark, both of them cold down to the bone. The support was set. The east wall was stable. Nathan sat down across from Ethan at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, Ed said the beam came down fast. He said you pushed him out of the way first. Ethan said nothing. Is that true? Nathan said. A pause. Ed's old, Ethan said. His joints don't move the way they used to. That's not an answer. Ethan looked at him. The boy had Thomas Harper in him somewhere. She could see it in these moments, the stubbornness of a direct question that wouldn't be deflected. Yes, Ethan said. It's true. Nathan nodded slowly. He looked at the table and then back up. Thank you, he said, for looking out for him. Ed, who had come in behind Nathan and heard this, made a sound at the stove that could have been anything. Adeline made dinner, pork with the dried beans she'd been soaking since morning and the last of the bread from the afternoon's bake. She worked, and the kitchen was full of people and steam, and the smell of food, and outside the storm was beginning, just barely beginning, to relent. After dinner, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the children were in bed, Oliver had gone without argument tonight, which meant he was tired enough for sleep to outweigh everything else. Adeline sat at the kitchen table across from Ethan, who should have been in bed but wasn't yet, and they were both quiet. 4 years, she said. He looked at her. You've been running this alone for 4 years. She folded her hands on the table. That's a long time. It is, he said. Doesn't mean you have to keep doing it, she said. He held her gaze. He had steady eyes. She had noticed this early on, that Ethan Whitmore didn't look away from things, which was either a strength or a habit he'd built to look like one. With him, she had come to believe it was actually a strength. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. The stove ticked. The wind outside went on doing what it was doing, but with perhaps a fraction less certainty than it had shown all day. Adeline stood and cleared the last cups from the table. Get some sleep, she said. You need to keep still if those ribs are going to be any kind of bearable by morning. Yes, ma'am, he said. Said it with such deliberate dryness that she stopped and looked at him, and this time the almost smile had crossed the line into something actual, brief and real, gone before it fully arrived but there. She went to bed. In the small room at the end of the hall, she lay in the dark and listened to the storm, losing the argument it had been making for 3 days, losing it in degrees, the wind dropping by measured increments that you could track if you paid attention. In a few hours it would be over and the road to Garrison would be possible, and there would be a doctor for Ethan's ribs and a lawyer for the documents, and the long work of the February hearing would begin. But that was morning. Right now there was the dark and the stove heat moving through the walls, and 3 children sleeping, and a man down the hall who had pushed an old man out of the way of a falling beam without thinking about himself, and had sat in a kitchen with cracked ribs and told her things he hadn't told anyone in 4 years, and who had said, with his steady eyes on hers, no, she wasn't leaving. Don't ask him again. She lay with all of that and felt the specific weight of a life rearranging itself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way real rearrangements happen, incrementally, and then more than you expected. And then you look around and everything is in a different place than where it started, and you understand that you are too. Outside, the last of the storm moved east, taking its noise with it, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but full of snow and cold, and 3 days of survival, and the specific quiet of a house that had held. The morning after the storm was the kind of quiet that felt earned. Not peaceful exactly. There was too much work ahead for peaceful. But the specific quiet of a thing that had done its worst and passed on. The snow had settled 3 feet deep across the yard and drifted higher against the north-facing walls, and the sky had gone from the pewter gray of the past 3 days to something blue and sharp and cold, in a way that had no malice in it anymore. Just cold. Just winter being winter, which was manageable. Adeline was at the stove at 4:30, same as always. She heard Ethan before she saw him, the careful movement down the hall, the slight pause at the kitchen doorway that she'd come to understand was him registering the room before entering it, a habit so ingrained she doubted he knew he did it. He came in and his movement was different this morning, controlled. His left arm was slightly low, held closer to his body without being fully pressed against it, and he was breathing with deliberate shallowness, the way you do when expansion costs you. She handed him coffee without commenting on any of it. He accepted it and stood near the stove and was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her over the cup. "Bad enough that I'm going to take your advice and not lift anything heavy for a few days." From Ethan Whitmore, that was the same as admitting he'd been hit by a train. She noted it and moved on. "Ed can handle the barn," she said. "Nathan can go with him. The road to Garrison should be passable by mid-morning if what Ed said about drifts clearing on the south approach is right." "I need to see the doctor and then the lawyer," Ethan said. "In that order," she said. "In that order," he agreed. Ed was at the back door at 5, stamped his boots, came in, looked at Ethan the way a man looks at someone he pushed out of the way of a falling beam, and then watched absorb the impact that was meant for him for him. It was a complicated look, compressed into a second, and then set aside. "Road's going to be passable by 9, Ed said. "Maybe 8:30 if the sun holds." "We'll go at 9, Ethan said. "You and Nathan take the south fence check. Pete's hand keeps him inside today." Ed nodded. He looked at Ethan's posture once more, the careful way he was holding himself, and said nothing about it. Ed was a man who understood that some things were better acknowledged by not acknowledging them. The hands came in for breakfast, and the kitchen was loud in the way it had been before the storm. People talking, the sound of plates, someone complaining about the cold outside in a tone that was more relief than complaint. Pete sat with his bandaged hand resting on the table and ate left-handed without making a production of it. Calloway told a story about the 3rd morning of the storm that made 2 of the other hands laugh, and the laugh felt like something being released. Oliver came down while the men were still eating and immediately went to find his coat. "Where are you going?" Adeline said. "To check on Martha." After breakfast, he looked at the barn through the window. He looked at his mother. He sat down and ate with the speed of a boy who was not tasting anything. "She's fine," Pete told him, around a mouthful of bread. "I saw her this morning. She was on the hay bales looking like she owned the whole operation." Oliver slowed slightly. "Was she okay? Her paws?" Her paws were fine. Cats' paws get cold, Oliver said, with the authority of someone who had been researching this for weeks, and by research meant asking everyone on the ranch what they knew about cats. She's a Montana barn cat, Pete said. Her paws have opinions about cold weather, and none of them involve being scared of it. Oliver considered this. That's actually good, he decided, and finished his breakfast. Ethan watched this exchange from the end of the table with the expression Adeline had catalogued as his particular response to Oliver, a kind of baffled attention, like a man watching something he didn't have a category for and had stopped trying to find one. By 8:30, the road was passable, as Ed had predicted. Ethan had the wagon hitched with Nathan's help. He directed more than he participated, which was itself a small capitulation, and Nathan had the good sense not to remark on it. Adeline had Lillian's ledger documentation wrapped in oilskin and the reorganized survey documents in the leather portfolio, all of it in a bag she'd packed the night before. Lillian came to the door of the house with her coat on. Ethan looked at her. "You're coming," he said. It wasn't a question. He had told her 2 days ago she'd come, and Lillian was not the kind of person who forgot things like that. "I have everything," she said, and held up her own set of notes. A clean copy she'd made of the ledger findings, in her precise handwriting, organized the way she had explained to Adeline she would organize it. Timeline first, pattern second, the connection to Hale's filing third. Ethan looked at the papers. "How much did you sleep last night?" "Enough," Lillian said. He looked at Adeline. "She was up at midnight," Adeline said. "She was done by 2. Ethan made the sound that wasn't quite anything. Not disapproval, not admiration, somewhere in the particular space between them that he occupied when a situation exceeded his expectations and he didn't have prepared language for it. He climbed into the wagon with the deliberate care of a man whose ribs were reminding him of everything, and Adeline climbed up beside him, and Lillian sat in the back with the bags, and they went to Garrison. The town looked different after the storm. Not damaged. Garrison was built by people who understood Montana winters and had constructed accordingly, but cleaned somehow. The streets were being dug out. People were moving between buildings with the purposeful energy of a community that had gotten through something and was now dealing with the aftermath. Heads turned when the Silver Creek wagon came down the main street. Adeline felt it, the attention. Not hostile, not exactly, but the specific weight of a small town tracking something it had opinions about. She kept her eyes forward and her hands in her lap and did not perform anything for the people watching. Dr. Havelock's office was on the south end of the main street. He was a compact, efficient man in his 50s who had been practicing in Garrison for 20 years and had seen everything the frontier had to offer in terms of human damage. He looked at Ethan's ribs with his hands and then with a grim, satisfied expression said 2 were cracked and 1 was fractured. "I've had worse," Ethan said. "I know you have," Havelock said. "This is still going to hurt for 6 weeks, and you're going to do something to make it worse in the first 3, because you always do, and then it'll hurt for 8 weeks instead." He wrapped the ribs properly, tighter than Adeline had managed with the cloth, but along the same logic. No lifting, no twisting. Try not to breathe hard. "In Montana in January," Ethan said. "Do your best," Havelock said dryly. He looked at Adeline. "You did the field wrapping?" "Yes." "Good work," he said, with the economy of a man who didn't deploy compliments carelessly. He looked at Lillian, who had been sitting in the corner of the office being invisible in the way she sometimes managed, watching everything. "Yours?" "Yes," Adeline said. He looked at Lillian for a moment. Lillian looked back at him with her steady, assessing eyes. He said, in a tone that meant something Adeline liked, and he turned back to Ethan's paperwork. The attorney's office was above the land office on the main street, up a narrow stair that Ethan took slowly. His name was Gareth Moss. 60s, broad, with the kind of face that had started out unimpressive and accumulated authority over decades. He had been Ethan's lawyer for 15 years and had the manner of a man who knew his client well enough to know when something had changed. He looked at Ethan coming through the door, then at Adeline, then at Lillian, then back at Ethan. He said, "You brought people." "I brought the people who found things," Ethan said. He sat down carefully. Moss looked at the careful way he sat. Ribs? Yesterday, Ethan said. Havelock? This morning. Moss accepted this with the nod of a man who processed information quickly and moved on. February 15th is the hearing, he said. Hale's filing has been accepted by the county committee. We knew that was coming. He looked at the bag Adeline was holding. What did you bring me? They laid it out on his desk. Adeline walked him through the reorganized survey documents first, the argument she had built from the evidence, the sequence that made the water rights claim self-evident. Moss read as she explained and made sounds that were not words but communicated close attention. He asked 2 questions, sharp, specific, and she answered both of them. Then Lillian put her notes on the desk. Moss looked at Lillian. You're the daughter? Yes, sir, Lillian said. How old? 13? He looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing, which Moss had learned over 15 years meant wait and see. Lillian walked him through the ledger findings. She did it the way she had done everything in her life that mattered. Precisely, without decoration, making the logic clear at each step before moving to the next one. Timeline. Pattern. The connection to Hale's filing. She had the original ledger entries tabbed with small pieces of paper she had torn and placed herself. She had the clean copy of her notes, which Moss could keep. When she was done, the room was quiet. Moss looked at the notes for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Where did you find her? She came with the cook, Ethan said. Moss looked at Adeline, then back at Lillian. This is solid, he said. He tapped the notes with 2 fingers. The timing correlation is circumstantial, but it's consistent enough to be compelling. The amounts, if I can show the committee that Torrance's billing practices shifted specifically after Hale's filing, that goes to bad faith. He picked up the notes. This is genuinely solid. Lillian said, the original ledger entries are bookmarked on tabs. The copies I made match exactly. I can verify them if anyone asks. You'll verify them, Moss said. In February. I'm going to need you there. Lillian looked at her mother. Adeline looked at Ethan. Ethan said, she'll be there. Moss spent another 30 minutes going through the survey documents, making notes, asking Adeline twice more to clarify her organizational logic. He was a man who did not waste professional attention on things that didn't deserve it, and he was giving this his full attention, which told Adeline more than any compliment would have. When they left the office and came back down the narrow stair, Garrison's main street was fully alive with the mid-morning business of a town clearing up after 3 days of storm. And the first person they encountered at the bottom of the stair was Victor Hale. He was not there by accident. That was the first thing Adeline registered, the specific quality of his position, just at the base of the stair, close enough that they couldn't come down without being seen and couldn't pretend they hadn't seen him. It was a man's move who had been waiting, and he hadn't bothered to make it look like anything else. He looked at Ethan, at Adeline, at Lillian. Ethan, he said pleasantly, heard you had some trouble with the storm. Nothing we didn't handle, Ethan said. Ribs? Victor looked at the way Ethan was holding himself. I'm upright, Ethan said. Victor's gaze moved to Adeline. The pleasantness didn't change. It was a fixed thing, like paint on wood. Mrs. Harper, he said, coming from the lawyer's office. Mr. Hale, she said. He looked at Lillian. Something moved in his expression. Calculation, possibly. He had not met Lillian before. She was a 13-year-old girl in a winter coat with a leather satchel under her arm, which was not a thing that would alarm most people. It seemed to alarm Victor Hale, or at least to register as something worth noting. The hearing's in 3 weeks, he said, back to Ethan. I want you to know there's no personal animosity in this. The water rights are a legal matter. The county will decide. They will, Ethan agreed. I've been talking to some people, Victor said, and the pleasant tone developed a specific texture. Not a threat, not overtly, but something with edges. People in town who have opinions about how this valley should be managed, who should be sitting on land committees, what kind of ranchers the county should be backing. He paused. A man's reputation matters in these decisions, how he runs his operation, the choices he makes. Ethan held his gaze. Is that right? He said. I think you're a smart enough man to know what I'm saying, Victor said. I think I am, Ethan said. I think I also know that the county committee is made up of 3 men, 2 of whom have known me for 20 years, and 1 of whom had dinner at Silver Creek last spring. I think reputation cuts more than one way in a county this size. He took a slow breath, careful, measured, the ribs dictating the pace. And I think that if a man's billing agent has been double invoicing him for 18 months on a schedule that correlates to a specific date, that's the kind of thing a county committee might find worth knowing about. Victor's pleasantness held for another second. Then it didn't. It wasn't dramatic. His face didn't fall, he didn't flinch, but something behind the pleasant expression shifted, and what was behind it was not pleasant at all. He looked at Lillian again, at the satchel. Then he looked at Ethan. I see, he said. I thought you might, Ethan said. Victor touched his hat brim, the gesture so performed it was almost theatrical, and walked away down the main street. None of them said anything until he was well gone. Then Lillian said quietly and without particular emphasis, "He didn't know about the ledger." "No," Ethan said. "He didn't." "He does now." "He does now," Ethan agreed, "which means he'll do something before February 15th. He'll move faster than he planned." He looked at Moss's office window above them. "We should go back up and tell Moss what just happened." They went back up the stair. The drive back to Silver Creek was quieter than the drive in had been. The road was still difficult, drifted in places, icy in others, and Ethan concentrated on managing the horse through it, which also gave him a reason to concentrate on something other than his ribs. Adeline sat beside him and watched the road and thought about Victor's face in that moment when the pleasantness had slipped. "He's going to go after Torrance," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He'll try to get the evidence cleaned up before the hearing." "Can Torrance make it go away?" "Not if Moss moves fast. The original entries are in the ledger. Torrance can't alter a ledger that's in our possession." He looked at the road. "Moss is going to contact the county clerk today and file a notice of evidence. That puts it into the official record. After that, Torrance altering anything makes it worse for him, not better." "Did you plan that?" she asked. "The conversation with Victor?" A pause. "I planned for him to be there," Ethan said. "He watches the lawyer's office. He knows when I go in. He was going to be at the bottom of those stairs whether I planned for it or not. And the things you said. I wanted him to know we had something, not what exactly, just that we had it." He adjusted his grip on the reins. A man who doesn't know what's coming at him imagines the worst and starts making mistakes. Victor Hale's biggest weakness is that he's been in control of everything for so long that he doesn't know how to move carefully when he feels it slipping. Adeline looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a long time." 2 years, he said. "Since the first filing." "Alone," she said. He didn't answer that, but she saw what happened in his face, the small recognition of something he hadn't wanted to see clearly until recently. In the back of the wagon, Lillian had her notes in her lap and was looking at the snow-covered landscape with the expression she wore when she was thinking about numbers, inward and steady, following something only she could see. "Lillian," Adeline said. Lillian looked up. "You did well today," Adeline said. Lillian considered this without false modesty or excessive pleasure. "Mr. Moss is good," she said. "He asked the right questions." "So did you," Adeline said. Lillian looked at Ethan's back. "Will it be enough?" she asked. "For the hearing?" Ethan spoke without turning. "It'll be more than enough," he said. "The question is whether Hale does something between now and then that changes what we're arguing against." He paused. "But that's for Moss to manage. You did your part." Lillian sat back. She held her notes carefully against her chest, the way someone holds something that matters, not ostentatiously, just with the quiet attention of someone who knows its value. They got back to Silver Creek at early afternoon. The barn was standing, the south fence check was done, Pete's hand was clean and unkindly described by Pete himself as hurting less than it looked like it should. Nathan had found 2 more split fence posts on the west line and repaired one of them with Ed's supervision, which Ed mentioned to Ethan in the clipped, factual way of a man delivering a report rather than praise. Oliver had spent the morning with Martha, who had spent the storm in the hay and appeared entirely unbothered by the whole experience. Oliver had also apparently had a long conversation with Pete about Montana wildlife, during which Pete had made the mistake of mentioning that there were wolves in the northern range, and Oliver had developed a series of extremely detailed follow-up questions that Pete was still answering when Adeline arrived. The afternoon settled into the work of recovery. Not dramatic work, just the unglamorous accumulation of tasks that a property required after 3 days of being battered. Adeline went through the kitchen stores and began calculating what needed to be replaced in the next supply run. Lillian made a clean final copy of her notes and put them with the documents in the leather portfolio. Nathan and Ed went back to the west fence line. Oliver helped Pete with equipment cleaning, which mainly meant Oliver talked and Pete cleaned, but Pete seemed to find the arrangement acceptable. Ethan sat in his study for the first time in 4 days. Adeline knocked on the open door frame at 3 in the afternoon. He looked up from his desk. He had papers in front of him. Not the survey documents, those were with Moss now, but something else. His hand was resting on them, but he wasn't writing. "You should rest," she said. "I'm sitting," he said. "You've been sitting tense for 4 hours. That's different from resting." He looked at her with the expression that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat in the straight-back chair across the desk, the one that visitors had probably been sitting in for 15 years, though she suspected visitors had been rare. She looked at the papers under his hand. "Clara's letters," he said, before she could ask or not ask. "I got them out this morning. I haven't looked at them in 2 years." She said nothing. "I don't know why I'm telling you that," he said. "Maybe because it's easier to say something out loud than to sit with it alone," she said. "And you've gotten used to that being an option." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Maybe that." He set the letters aside. Not away, just to the side. "The storm showed me something," he said. "I knew the property was sound. I had the accounts documented and the water survey done and the legal argument prepared. I thought I had what I needed." He looked at the desk. "I didn't have anyone to tell me where the gaps were. Lillian found one in 2 days that had been bleeding me for 18 months. You reorganized 2 years of documentation in an afternoon in a way that Moss said he could actually use." "We found what we found because we were looking from outside," Adeline said. "You can't always see the gaps when you're the one standing in them." "No," he said. "You can't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What I'm trying to say and not doing well is that I understand now what I'd been building without knowing it. 4 years of making the ranch self-sufficient, making myself sufficient, thinking that was the same as being strong." He stopped. "It isn't." She looked at him across the desk. The afternoon light was coming through the window at a low angle, and it was showing his age. Not in a diminishing way, but in the way that good light shows what a face has earned. The lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the set of a jaw that had been set against things for a long time. "Thomas and I used to argue," she said, "about exactly this. He thought self-sufficiency was a virtue. I thought it was sometimes a substitute for trust." She paused. "I think we were both right depending on the year." He almost smiled. "Who won the argument?" "Nobody," she said. "We just kept having it in different forms until there wasn't any more time to have it." He was quiet. "I don't want to waste the time I have left having the same argument with myself," he said. It was one of the most direct things she had heard him say, and she understood it cost him something to say it. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of the house. Footsteps somewhere. Probably Nathan, the distant voice of Oliver, the tick of the stove. "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. She said it plainly, without pressure, without the weight of anything she expected him to do about it immediately, just as a statement of possibility. A door standing open. He said, "There's something I need to say to you." She waited. "When I let you through the gate," he said, "I told you it was temporary. I meant it when I said it. I'm not sure exactly when I stopped meaning it." He seemed to be working out the honest answer even as he spoke, which was something she had come to understand was how he operated. He didn't perform thinking, he actually did it in front of you, and this was both admirable and occasionally uncomfortable. By the time the storm hit, I knew the word didn't apply anymore. I just didn't know what word did. She held his gaze. What word does? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Home, he said. That's the one that fits. The word sat between them. She felt it. Not sentimentally, not with the rush of feeling she might have expected. She felt it the way you feel something solid, with relief and a kind of recognition, the way you feel when a door closes properly and you understand that it's the right fit. I have conditions, she said. He blinked. Then, and this time it was fully there, not almost, not the ghost of it. He smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten he had one and had just been reminded. Of course you do, he said. The children have a say, she said, all three of them. If any of them aren't ready for this, it doesn't happen on their timetable. Fair, he said, and I don't manage your household, she said. I live in it. There's a difference. I know the difference, he said. Clara taught me that too. She looked at him. He said Clara's name without flinching now. Not often, but when he did, it had the quality of something he'd made peace with rather than something he was still losing. She respected that. Then yes, she said. Home is the right word. She stood because there was still dinner to make and the afternoon wasn't going to wait, and she went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and thought about the letter that had arrived last month from Thomas's sister in Richmond. Margaret, the practical one, who had written with the kind of concern that was genuine but had assumed a conclusion. Come east, Margaret had written. Come home. The children need stability. You need family around you. What you're doing out there isn't sustainable. Adeline had read the letter 3 times. She had not answered it yet. She thought about it now, with her hands moving through the familiar motions of the kitchen. She thought about what Margaret meant by home, and what she meant by sustainable, and how both of those words assumed you were the same person you'd been in Virginia with Thomas and 3 children and a plan that was still intact. She wasn't. She had come through 6 months in a blizzard and a gate she'd pushed open when every sensible thing said stop, and she was not the same, and the place she was standing in right now, this kitchen, in this house, in this state that had been arguing with her since October about whether she belonged, was the most like home she had felt since the morning Thomas couldn't get out of bed. She was going to write to Margaret. She had been composing the letter in pieces for days without knowing it. Nathan came in from the west fence line while she was working, cold and tired and capable looking in the way he'd been getting more and more since they'd arrived. He washed his hands at the basin, and she saw his hands properly in the lamplight, and they were different from the hands of the boy who had stood in the Garrison street and watched Victor Hale dismiss his family. They were a working boy's hands now, and he was looking at them too with the quiet awareness of someone noting a change. Ed says the fence will hold through February, he said. After that, we'll need to replace 2 full sections. Tell Mr. Whitmore, Adeline said. Nathan paused. He looked at her in the way he had when he needed to say something that wasn't quite the thing he'd started to say. Is this going to keep being our place? He asked. Here. She looked at her son. He was 15 and had buried his father and walked a frozen road and worked alongside men twice his age, and had held himself together through all of it with the specific kind of determination that doesn't come from confidence, but from having already survived the worst you can imagine. Yes, she said. He looked at the kitchen, at the stove and the shelves and the window that looked out at the barn. He nodded once, the way his father used to nod when something had been settled. Good, he said. Then, I'll go tell Ed to start the list for the February fence repair. He went back outside. Adeline stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. Then she got on with dinner. 2 days later, the letter from Margaret arrived. Not the one Adeline had been writing in her head, a new one. It had been written before the storm, caught in the backlog of the Garrison Postal Service that had suspended delivery during the worst 3 days. It was longer than the first letter, and its tone had shifted slightly, which told Adeline that Margaret had been thinking since she sent the first one. She read it at the kitchen table in the evening after dinner, while Ethan was in his study and the children were in their room. Margaret had written about the family land in Richmond that their uncle was thinking of selling. She had written about a cousin who had a dry goods operation and needed reliable help. She had written, carefully and with genuine kindness, about how Thomas would have wanted the children to have roots, stability, a community that knew them. And she had written, at the end, the paragraph that told Adeline what the letter was actually about. I worry you are staying out of stubbornness rather than sense, Adeline. I know you. You don't like to admit when something hasn't worked. But there is no shame in coming home. Adeline set the letter down and looked at it for a long moment. She picked up her pen. She thought about what to say and how to say it, and then she wrote, with the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what is true. Margaret, I am grateful for your concern, and I know it comes from love. But I want to tell you what home means to me now, because I think our definitions have grown apart. Home is not the place you came from. It is the place that asks something real of you and lets you answer. I have answered here. My children have answered here. We are not staying out of stubbornness. We are staying because we belong to this place, and it belongs to us, in the way that takes time to become true and then is simply true. I will write again soon. Give my love to the family. She folded the letter, sealed it, put it on the table to go to Garrison with the next supply run. Then she sat with her hands in her lap in the quiet kitchen, with the stove making its small ticking sounds, and the cold pressing against the window, and the ranch around her doing what ranches do when the storm has passed. Just existing, just holding itself up in the aftermath, everything that had bent under the pressure now finding out what shape it was going to settle into. She had not expected this. She had expected the job or the refusal. She had not expected the gate to open, or the man behind it, or the way that 3 months in a place could make it into the thing she had been looking for without knowing it. She had not expected to be sitting in a kitchen in Montana at the end of January feeling, in the most unglamorous and unannounced way possible, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But there it was. And in 2 weeks, they were going to a land office hearing that would determine whether Victor Hale had the right to redirect a creek, and the argument that would stop him was wrapped in oilskin in a leather portfolio, organized by a woman who had walked 2 hours in the cold on a January morning, documented by a 13-year-old who liked numbers because they were honest, and built on 8 years of surveys kept by a man who had almost forgotten what he was protecting them for. Whatever happened in that hearing room was going to happen to all of them together. Not temporarily. Not as an arrangement. As a family that had not planned itself but had, under pressure and cold and the specific demands of a Montana winter, become one anyway. The 15th of February came in cold and clear, the kind of Montana morning that had no sympathy for what people needed to do in it. Ethan was up before 4. Adeline heard him moving through the house, careful still, the ribs not fully healed, 3 weeks out from the beam, and still governing how he breathed when he forgot to be careful about it. She got up and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the dark, without saying much, which had become a thing they did, and neither of them had named. Lillian came down at 5 with her satchel already over her shoulder. Nobody commented on this. It was simply Lillian. The ride to Garrison took an hour in the cold. Nathan stayed at the ranch with Ed. Someone had to, and Nathan had understood this without being asked, which was its own kind of maturity. He had stood in the yard when they left and watched the wagon go with his jaw set and his hands in his pockets, and Adeline had looked back once and seen him turn toward the barn, already thinking about the day's work. Oliver had been left in Pete's care, which Oliver had accepted on the condition that Pete would tell him more about wolves. The county land office was a single-story building on the east end of Garrison's Main Street, and it was already occupied when Ethan's wagon arrived. Moss was there, with a younger man who carried his documents. 3 members of the county committee sat at the long table at the front of the room. Men in their 50s and 60s, ranchers themselves once or still, with the weathered patience of people who had been settling disputes in this valley for decades. Victor Hale was there with 2 men Adeline didn't recognize. Lawyers from Billings, she gathered from the quality of their coats and the way they arranged their papers with professional precision. Victor saw Ethan come in, and his expression did the thing it had done at the bottom of the stair. The pleasantness that was a performance, but thinner now, with less material behind it. He looked at Lillian and the satchel and then looked away. The hearing opened without ceremony. The committee chairman, a man named Aldrich, who had known Ethan for 20 years and was careful to show nothing on his face that could be construed as favor, read the terms of the dispute, and invited Hale's attorneys to present first. They were good. Adeline had expected that, and they were. They presented the water table argument cleanly. The geological case for the creek's source feeding both properties, the survey data they had commissioned the previous spring, the legal precedents from 2 other Montana counties where similar claims had been adjudicated. It took 40 minutes, and it was well constructed. When they finished, Aldrich looked at Moss. Moss stood and presented the counter-argument the way Adeline had organized it. Boundary first, historical course second, water table data third. He spoke for 30 minutes and was precise. The committee asked 4 questions, all of which he answered without hesitation. Then he said, "I'd like to present supplementary evidence regarding conduct related to this dispute." He nodded at Lillian. One of Hale's Billings attorneys said, "The witness is a child." Aldrich looked at the attorney. "The committee will determine relevance," he said, with the flat authority of a man who had been doing this for a long time and did not need a coat from Billings to tell him procedure. He looked at Lillian. "Go ahead." Lillian stood. She had the satchel in front of her, and she opened it and placed her documents on the table with the same precise attention she gave everything. She explained what she had found, beginning with the timeline. The first duplicate invoice 3 weeks after Hale's initial filing, the escalating amounts, the pattern across 18 months. She explained how she had identified the connection to Torrance's other clients. She spoke in the same voice she used at the kitchen table, clear, direct, without performance. The committee was quiet while she spoke. One of them, a rancher named Burley, who Adeline had heard mentioned as the sharpest of the 3, leaned forward partway through and did not lean back. When she finished, Aldrich said, "How old are you?" 13, Lillian said. Burley looked at the documents. "These are originals?" "The ledger entries are originals," Lillian said. "The summary is my own copy. They match exactly." Burley looked at Hale's attorneys. The Billings attorneys looked at their papers in the way lawyers look at papers when they need a moment and don't want to show they need it. Victor Hale looked at Lillian with an expression that had finally given up on pleasantness entirely. It took the committee 2 hours to deliberate, during which time Ethan sat in the hall outside the room with Adeline and Lillian and Moss, and they were mostly quiet. Ethan was holding himself carefully, the ribs still dictating the terms of how he occupied space. Adeline sat beside him. Lillian read through her notes again, not anxiously, just the way she read things, because there was something to read. Moss said, at one point, the Torrance documentation was the thing. They didn't have a response to it. Lillian found it, Ethan said. Moss looked at Lillian. "I know," he said. "I've been practicing law for 31 years. I want you to understand that what you did in there was not a small thing." Lillian received this without false modesty. "The numbers were there," she said. "Someone just had to read them." "Most people didn't," Moss said. The committee came back at noon. Aldrich read the finding without preamble. The water rights claim submitted by Victor Hale was denied. The evidence established that the creek's water table served the Silver Creek property exclusively within the legal boundary definitions. Furthermore, the committee was referring the billing discrepancy evidence to the county sheriff for investigation of potential fraud. Hale's attorneys were already packing their papers before Aldrich finished the second sentence. Victor Hale stood for a moment after his attorneys rose. He looked across the room at Ethan, not at Adeline, not at Lillian, at Ethan, and his face had finally settled into something honest. Not rage, not quite. Closer to the expression of a man who has run a calculation and found the answer he didn't want. Then he put on his hat and walked out, and the door closed behind him, and he did not look back. Ethan let out a breath, slow, careful, the ribs managing even that. He looked at Moss. "That's it?" "That's it," Moss said. "He can appeal to the territorial court, but the Torrance matter is going to make that a difficult choice. I don't think he'll try." Ethan nodded. He looked at Lillian, who was putting her documents back into the satchel with the same unhurried attention with which she did everything. "Lillian," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said things that he actually meant. Lillian held his gaze for a moment. "You kept the records," she said. "Someone just had to put them in order." He almost smiled. It had been happening more often lately. The almost becoming actual, the smile arriving fully if briefly. This was one of those times. They drove back to Silver Creek in the early afternoon, the light coming flat and gold across the snow. Adeline sat beside Ethan on the wagon bench, and the cold was significant but not brutal, the kind that was simply part of being outside in February rather than a thing with hostility in it. After a while, Ethan said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "I've been thinking about how to say it," he said. "I've been thinking about it for about 3 weeks, and I still don't have a version that sounds like something a man should say out loud." "Say the plain version," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved through the snow with patient, steady footsteps. "I'd like you to marry me," he said. "Not because the ranch needs managing or because the arrangement makes sense practically, though both of those things are also true. Because I want you to be my wife, because this last month has shown me what I had forgotten was possible." He looked at the road. "Because Oliver's right that this house was lonely before, and it isn't anymore. And I don't want to go back to what it was." Adeline looked at the road ahead. She thought about the gate, and the 2-hour walk in the cold, and $4.11, and a man who had said temporary and meant it, and then stopped meaning it without announcing when. She thought about Thomas, not with grief exactly, but with the honest acknowledgement of someone who carries a person with them and knows it, and has made a kind of peace with the carrying. Thomas had been the first half of her life's plan. He had been a good man and a flawed one, and she had loved him fully, and he was gone, and she was here. She was here. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He nodded once. He did not reach for her hand dramatically or say anything that would ruin the plainness of it. He just nodded, and she understood that for him this was the equivalent of everything, and she was glad to be a person who could understand that. From the back of the wagon, Lillian said, without looking up from her satchel, "I heard that." "I know you did," Adeline said. "Oliver is going to be very loud about it," Lillian said. "I know that too," Adeline said. Oliver was, in fact, very loud about it. He received the news that evening at the dinner table and immediately needed to tell Pete, and then Ed, and then apparently Martha, because he disappeared to the barn for 10 minutes and came back satisfied. Pete took the news with the expression of a young man who was genuinely happy for people he had come to care about and didn't know how to say it, so he said, "Well," which was the ranch's established vocabulary for things that exceeded expectation. Ed said nothing, but he looked at Ethan across the table with something in his face that was private and old. The look of a man who had watched another man carry something alone for a long time and was glad to see him set it down. Nathan was quiet through dinner. Adeline noticed and said nothing, letting him come to whatever he was working through on his own timeline. He was 15 and had been the man of his family for 4 months, and the adjustment required was real, and she respected it by not rushing it. After dinner, he found Ethan in the yard. She saw them through the kitchen window, Nathan and Ethan standing a few feet apart in the cold, talking. She couldn't hear it. She didn't try to. After a few minutes, Nathan held out his hand, and Ethan looked at it for a moment and then shook it, and that was apparently the thing that needed to happen between them, because Nathan came back inside with his shoulders lower than they'd been, in the good way. He said to Adeline, coming through the kitchen, "He said he knows he's not my father, and he's not trying to be." "That's true," Adeline said. "I told him I know that too." He looked at the stove. "I told him Thomas Harper would have liked him. That's what I think." He paused. "I think it's true." She looked at her son. "It is true," she said. He nodded and went to bed. Spring came to Silver Creek the way Montana spring came. Reluctantly, in increments, the snow retreating by degrees and the mud arriving in its place, which was its own kind of problem, but a manageable one. The south pasture opened first. Then the creek, running clear and cold and undivided, exactly as it had always run, along the boundary of the property it had always served. They married in April in the main room of the ranch house, with Ed and the hands as witnesses and Oliver in a clean shirt that he hated, and Lillian with her hair done up and Nathan standing straight in the way he stood now. Not tense, just present, holding himself with the quiet solidity of someone who had found his footing. It was not a large ceremony. It was not meant to be. It was two people agreeing to something they had already been building for months and putting a word to it, and that was enough. Victor Hale's appeal never materialized. Torrance was investigated and found to have been double billing 3 other ranches in the valley, 2 of which had active disputes with Hale properties, a fact that unraveled enough of his legal standing that he spent the rest of the year in a different kind of fight, one that had nothing to do with Silver Creek's water. He did not come by the ranch again. The valley noticed what had happened at that hearing. Not loudly. These were not people who made loud announcements about changed opinions. But Garrison noticed, and the neighboring ranches noticed, and the specific story of a 13-year-old girl with a ledger and a talent for numbers who had walked into a county committee room and presented a fraud case that the lawyers hadn't seen. That story moved through the valley in the way true things move, quietly and persistently. People came to the ranch more after that. Not many, not constantly, but more than before. Neighbors with questions about accounting, about water rights, about the kind of careful record-keeping that Ethan had been doing in isolation for years. Adeline made coffee, and Ethan talked, and Lillian sometimes sat at the edge of the conversation with her pencil and her notebook, and this too became a thing the ranch was known for. What Silver Creek Ranch was known for by summer was not the water rights hearing or the fraud case or the blizzard or any single thing. It was known for being a place where things worked, where the accounts were clean and the fences were tended and the food was good and the people inside it had figured out, through some combination of necessity and luck and stubbornness, how to function as something more than the sum of their separate difficulties. That is not a romantic thing to say about a family, but it is an honest one. Because the truth about what happened at Silver Creek Ranch in the winter of 1881 was not that a lonely man was saved by love, or that a desperate woman found shelter. Those are simpler stories than the one that actually happened. The one that actually happened was messier and more ordinary and far more worth telling. A man had built a wall around himself because walls are what you build when you've been hurt and you have the materials. A woman had kept walking when walking was the only option left, because that is what people do when stopping is not actually a choice. And 4 people had arrived at a gate and a question. Are you the man who lives alone? And the answer had turned out to be yes, but not for much longer. What changed Ethan Whitmore was not a grand gesture or a single moment. It was breakfast at 5 in the morning, and a girl who found numbers in ledgers that grown men had missed, and a boy who fixed a water pipe before the storm hit, and an old barn cat who had decided one small person was worth trusting. It was the specific, unglamorous accumulation of days lived alongside people who showed up and kept showing up and did not perform anything for him but simply were. That is the thing about walls. They don't come down because someone says the right thing. They come down because people keep being present until the wall becomes less necessary than the warmth. Oliver grew up on that ranch. He grew up knowing how to work and how to sit with an animal until it trusted you, and how to ask direct questions of people who needed someone to ask them. He grew up knowing what it looked like when adults chose each other honestly, without pretending the choice was without cost or complication. Lillian went east at 17 to study, with Ethan's full support and her mother's full blessing, carrying a letter of recommendation from Gareth Moss that said, in 31 years of practice, he had not met a mind more suited to the law. She came back at 22 with a law degree and a husband and a child of her own, and she came back to Montana because that was where her numbers had first meant something. Nathan worked Silver Creek. He worked it beside Ethan and then beside his own growing family, and he worked it with the same stubbornness and care that he had brought to a water pipe in a blizzard when he was 15 years old and had needed to be useful more than anything else in the world. The creek ran where it had always run. The south pasture was green every spring. The kitchen at Silver Creek Ranch was warm from 4:30 in the morning until late in the evening, and the hands who worked that ranch for the next decade would say, when asked, that the food was the best they'd had anywhere, and the house felt like a house somebody actually lived in. That is what it came down to finally. Not heroism, not drama, just a gate that stayed open, and people who walked through it, and the long, imperfect, necessary work of becoming home to one another. That is the story. And the only moral it has is the one you already know, but sometimes need someone else to say out loud. The greatest thing you can do with a wall you've built around yourself is notice that you built it, and then decide on some cold January morning with the wind coming down from the mountains, whether it's still doing what you put it there to do. Ethan Whitmore decided, and the gate stayed open.